Hello, and welcome to Touchstone Music. This is where I discuss albums and musical artists who have inspired and influenced me over the years. I'm currently doing a series on albums from the 1960s. These are albums I actually bought in the 1960s and which I've returned to over the years as touchstones for my own musical enjoyment, for inspiration, and also to learn new things and notice new things about them as my own musical perspectives change. One disclaimer, these are my views and opinions based on my experiences thus far, and they are subject to change depending on as I get new information and experience. The subject of today's album is an album by a group called Cream, and the album is Disraeli Gears. Cream are often listed as the first supergroup. They consisted of Ginger Baker on drums, Jack Bruce on bass and primary vocals, and Eric Clapton on guitar. They were called Cream because they were considered to be the cream of the crop of the current British musicians at that time. They formed in about 1960. Also, on a personal note, listening to this album specifically back in the 1960s when I first heard it, which would be about the winter of 1968, was what finally convinced me to start playing guitar as opposed to just being in the audience. I actually wanted to, and I'm a bit of an amateur musician since that time. So musically, this album was an epiphany for me. So I'll sort of give you my impression of how it struck me at the time that I bought it. Later, we'll talk about how I see it today. This introduced me to a new, heavier blues-based music than I'd been listening to, and it was also in the vanguard of a wave of this type of music that was going to change the course of underground music at the time. After high school, I had immersed myself in so-called underground music of the time. Largely, this consisted, in my case, of listening to the folk rock psychedelia coming out of the West Coast. So we'd be talking about bands like Jefferson Airplane, Country Joe and the Fish, Moby Grape, Buffalo Springfield, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Grateful Dead. Now, the reason these were called underground at the time is a little different than the way the phrase is used today, because basically there was only AM radio. FM radio had not yet, and album rock and so forth had not yet come into being. So what was going on was that whereas the radio stations were still singles-oriented, these new underground bands were not seeing it that way at all. They were seeing the whole album as a musical statement, and they weren't looking to, if singles came out of it, that was extra and it was accidental and it was a bonus. They were looking at the whole album as their musical statement. Okay, let's get into the review. First, the recording. The album was recorded in Atlantic Studios in New York City in May of 1967. What happened was the band was going on a North American tour, and so they booked some time in this what at the time was a state-of-the-art studio. It was an 8-track studio. They didn't have anything like that in Britain. I think 4-track was the most they had in Britain at that time. And recorded it over a couple of days. Now, they were very fortunate because they had 2 people in the sound booth that really eventually became legends in the music business. Felix Pappalardi is a producer. Tom Dowd is the sound engineer. Now, Felix Pappalardi later went on to even greater fame because he started his own blues rock band with a singer-guitar player called Leslie West. The band was called Mountain. They started up in about 1969, and they were a big draw on the concert circuit in the early 1970s. Tom Dowd is equally famous in terms of especially multi-track recording. He's one of the people who's sort of the founder of multi-track recording. He worked with the who's who of rock, pop, jazz, blues, soul over the years. So having those 2 people in the studio were just they struck gold with those 2. Disraeli Gears was the second studio album of the band Cream. The first one was their groundbreaking first record called Fresh Cream, which had come out the year before. The new album was released in November 1967, meaning it was probably about 3 or 4 months old by the time I heard it. Of course, at the time I heard it, I didn't know anything about recording. I didn't know anything about the band members or the band. This was all brand new to me. But what I didn't realize was I had heard some of their work without realizing it on the radio because they had played in bands from Britain like the Yardbirds and Manfred Mann who had actually had songs on the radio. Another personal note, one of the songs off this album, Disraeli Gears, was called Sunshine of Your Love. As it happens, that's the first song I taught myself when I was learning to play guitar around this time. And as it was for most of my contemporaries, by the way, I think it was sort of the gold standard of first tunes until a band called Deep Purple came out with a song a few years later called Smoke on the Water, and all the guitar newbies immediately switched to having that as the first song that they taught themselves. But this more blues-based driving rock, blues rock sound for Cream was new to me, and it was, for me, it was love at first listen. Talk about the title for a moment. I don't always talk about the titles of albums, because sometimes it's pretty self-evident where the title came from. Very often it's one of the songs on the album. In this case, however, there was no song on the album named Disraeli Gears. And as far as I know, before this album, there was not even the term Disraeli Gears. So where did it come from? The story goes like this. Eric Clapton was talking to one of the roadies, one of the people who handle their equipment, and they were talking about English racing bikes. And racing bikes have something called derailleur gears. But the roadie didn't quite know that term. He knew there was some kind of a name for it, but didn't know what it was. So he said, "Oh, them bikes with Disraeli gears." Now, where did he get that term from? Obviously, he conflated it from something else. It turns out Disraeli, Benjamin Disraeli that is, was a British prime minister from the 19th century. And he just got those two terms conflated. Well, the band thought this was hilarious. And they decided it would be the perfect name for their new album. And hence Disraeli Gears was born. Next, I'm going to talk about the album cover. And this is going to be a regular part of these reviews because it's difficult to explain to someone raised on CDs or cassettes before that the impact of a 12 by 12 inch album cover. Before the Beatles, particularly before about 65 or 66, when they were putting out albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, album covers were generally just a picture of the band or the artist. But the Beatles sort of started to change that, and immediately everyone else took that up, and there was suddenly this marriage of the modern artists of the time and the bands, and suddenly these album covers, in fact, sometimes were literally turned into poster art. In fact, I knew people, and I think I was one of them, who would cut the album, put it on the wall, and that would be your poster, because this new artistic expression, psychedelic art and so forth, was so striking, and it would actually draw you in. You would be going through the record shelves trying to find an album, and you'd see an album cover that interested you, and that's what would actually get you interested in the album. You hadn't even heard the music yet, but you were already interested in it. So Disraeli Gears' cover is credited to an Australian artist who was living in Britain at that time named Martin Sharp. He actually comes into this album in a couple of different ways, and I'll explain that in a second. But he was living in the same building, as the story goes, in the Chelsea district of London, a building called the Pheasantry, I believe, which had once been a business, I think, and now was turned into studio apartments and so forth, as Eric Clapton. And they got to know each other. And the first thing that happened was Sharp came to him and said, "Look, I've written this poem. I think it might be good lyrics for a song. What do you think?" And Clapton, who had been working on a melody at that time and was looking for some lyrics for it, asked for a copy of the poem. A few weeks later, this new song showed up on this new Disraeli Gears album. It was a song called Tales of Brave Ulysses, which we'll review in a moment. Now, as far as the cover goes, the front cover is a psychedelic collage. It's surrounded by a sort of a floral arrangement, which was typical of that time. It's painted in these very bright, warm, fluorescent colors. Sharp said what he heard in their music was a warm, fluorescent sound, and he was trying to depict that sound that he heard in Cream's music. The rear of the album cover is a photo collage of the band in various locations. The photographer was a fellow named Bob Whitaker. He'd worked on other album covers for other bands as well. And this collage, again, there's more sort of vaguely floral artwork woven through it, but it's dominated by this large eye in the center, which is sort of more psychedelia. Now, let's do a track-by-track review of the album. Start with side one of the original vinyl recording. The first track on that recording was a song called Strange Brew. It was ascribed to Eric Clapton, Felix Pappalardi, the producer, and his writing partner, his wife, Gail Collins. I'll tell you honestly, even at the time, the lyrics struck me as being a little sappy, a little hippy dippy, as we used to call it, a little bit of pop psychology thrown in there. But under it was this excellent, creamy, smooth, no pun intended, Albert King style melody, which Clapton, to his credit, had insisted on using. Here's a side note there. Cream used the exact same melody for another song that they used to do perform at that time called Lottie Mama, and they did it note for note the way Albert King had originally done it. Next is the song that I mentioned before, and it's perhaps one of their most famous tracks. It's called Sunshine of Your Love. It's written by Jack Bruce, Eric Clapton, and Jack's frequent writing partner, a chap named Pete Brown, who was basically known as a lyricist, and an excellent one, I might add. Bruce is credited with coming up with the bass line, but I personally think it's Ginger Baker's tom-tom heavy drumming that really drives this song forward. Another interesting note, Clapton later revealed that at the beginning of his solo, midway through the song, he actually started out, his solo is based on the melody of the old pop standard Blue Moon from the 1930s. And if you listen to it closely, you can actually hear that that's what he's playing for the first few notes before he switches to a more familiar blues rock progression. Now, in retrospect, many people have considered this song as proto-heavy metal, and I don't think that they're wrong in that. Just checking my notes here. Next was World of Pain by Felix Pappalardi and Gail Collins. Now, in this one, I want you to listen to the way Clapton's wad guitar line counterpoints Bruce's vocal, and later to Clapton's unique overdubbed outro lines. This was followed by Dance the Night Away, written by Bruce and Brown. The boys make their smooth vocal harmonies sound easy here. Ginger's drumming relentlessly drives this song forward, and Clapton, as always, adds creative, layered guitar work in the background to carry the song to its conclusion. I'm a huge fan of Eric Clapton. For me, he will always be the man on electric guitar. He's the person who inspired me to first start playing myself. And I personally believe that he could have made a premier studio musician had he gone in that direction, because he was so creative in the studio in creating original guitar lines. Side one is rounded out by a song called Blue Condition. This is the only song that's credited to Ginger Baker on this, and it's the only one of two to feature him on lead vocals. Baker was not a prolific songwriter in Cream. His best known and best loved song from that era is probably a song called Pressed Rat and Warthog from their follow-up studio album Wheels of Fire. The song was originally written for his children, as I understand. Now, on side two, on the vinyl record we're talking about now, we start with Tales of Brave Ulysses. As I mentioned before, this is the first song actually a fellow played for me when he played the album for me. The first time I'd heard wah guitar pedal, I was instantly, and have been ever since, a sucker for wah guitar. And also I was struck by the lyrics. Now, as mentioned, the lyrics were actually by Martin Sharp, the artist who was responsible for the cover. And it talks about a trip to the Aegean Islands, and it uses Homer's Odyssey as an analogy. So listen to the opening lines here. You thought the leaden winter would bring you down forever, but you rode upon a steamer to the violence of the sun. Now, what are they saying here? The poem's protagonist has fled the gray, depressing British winter, and he's taken a ship to the blazing sun of the Aegean Islands. He meets a girl there, they have an affair, and even ultimately considers bringing her back with him to Britain at the end of his trip. But woven through this simple song are references to the epic poem, The Odyssey, by the ancient Greek poet Homer. And for you literary buffs, The Odyssey is the companion piece to the Iliad, which tells the story of the Trojan War. Now, the Odyssey chronicles Odysseus, or Ulysses in Roman, journey back home from Troy after the Trojan War. I can tell you, for my 18-year-old self, hearing all this, hearing this music I hadn't heard before, hearing this wah pedal music I hadn't heard before, hearing these sort of mythologically based lyrics, this was pretty heady stuff for my 18-year-old self, and I was basically, as they say, gobsmacked. Now, next tune, what can I say about this? The title is actually, I don't think it's meant to be pronounced, but I'm going to try my best. Slobber? Slobber? Swlabr. How would you pronounce that? It was penned by Jack Bruce and Pete Brown, and it's an acronym, which supposedly stands for She Walks Like a Bearded Rainbow. Anyway, Swabber showed that Cream could still rev up the engine whenever they wish. The band stays tight. Clapton adds more creative guitar fills. Next is one of my all-time favorite tracks, We're Going Wrong by Jack Bruce. The story goes, and my understanding was that Bruce was having some marital problems at the time, and that's what the song was about. But in any case, he gives, now what is that term? Bravura? Anyway, he gives us this epic, probably the best vocal performance on the album. And he's perfectly backed up by his bandmates, Clapton and Baker, with their restrained performance in the background. I especially love Clapton's lead lines in this. And here's an interesting fact. A few years ago, I found the extended CD with a bunch of outtakes from the original recordings. And one of them was another version of this same song, where Clapton takes a totally different tack on his lead lines. And I guess they had to pick between the two. And personally, I think they picked the right one for the original album to be put on the album. But I do find the other one interesting. And if you ever get a chance to pick up that CD, look for that track so you can sort of compare the two. It's interesting to see how even in the studio, songs develop and change. And then eventually they have to sort of make a decision about which one they're going to put on the album. Now, the other one is good, but I do prefer the original one. I think they made the right choice. After that is an arrangement of Arthur Reynolds' Outside Woman Blues, and it shows us that Clapton has lost none of his blues sensibilities during his forays into psychedelia. Before this, he was known as Britain's literally premier blues guitarist. Second to last track, Take It Back, another Pete Brown, Jack Bruce collaboration. Supposedly, I didn't understand the lyrics at the time. I had to have it explained to me in an interview later by one of the writers, and they said it was actually about opposing the U.S. military draft at the time. Remember, these were the days of the Vietnam War, and there was starting to be quite a resistance, not only to the U.S. draft, but to their presence in Vietnam. Not only in America, but overseas, people were starting to feel that there was something wrong with that situation. Now, it's true that song lyrics from the 60s sometimes were somewhat obscure. They're a bit like impressionist paintings. You could sort of put your own meaning to it, and your subjective idea was probably just as good as your friends about what the song actually meant. But I think in this case, Bruce and Brown might have got a bit too obscure, at least for somebody like me. Granted, I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but the lyrics literally went straight over my head until I finally read a review somewhere where one of them explained what it was about years later. However, having said that, I rather like this track. I like Jack's harmonica. I like Clapton and Baker keeping the energy really high as the song goes on. And also I like the party sounds in the background because it reminds me of just having a really good night at an English pub. And speaking of an English pub, the last song, Mother's Lament, is the band's arrangement of a traditional English pub song, and it's sort of sung-spoken by Ginger Baker. Now, this is an odd song to put on a psychedelic blues album, but here's the background to that. Clapton has said that he and his bandmates in the early days were heavily influenced by the Dadaist movement in art. I'll let you Google that and find out. But basically, it meant they were trying to put absurdist and unexpected elements into their playing and their recording and their what they were presenting to their audience. And so a song like this fits that mold perfectly, where they put in something that the audience simply wouldn't have expected. So for me, that song sort of meets that standard and fits that mold. Okay, well, to summarize, Disraeli Gears is a touchstone album for me. Maybe the more so because for a guitar-based album by a heavy rock group like Cream, as they were at the time, this is a surprisingly restrained album. It's also, to my mind, the most musically diverse of all the studio albums that they put out. And there were a lot of different directions they could have followed, some of which they did, but sadly, time was running out for the band, and by the end of 1968, they had pretty well broken up due to internal tensions. I had my favorites of the album at the time, in no particular order: Tales of Brave Ulysses, Sunshine of Your Love, Strange Brew, We're Going Wrong, and Outside Woman Blues were the ones that sort of immediately struck me. And there's no surprise that those are the ones that most prominently feature Eric Clapton's guitar. Full disclosure, I'm a huge fan of Eric Clapton, have been since the day I first heard him. Since then, I've learned to appreciate more of the musical subtleties, however, on this album, and there's virtually things to recommend on every song in this album now from my new musical perspective. So there's the first episode, and what I'm aiming will be at least a couple of dozen album reviews from the 1960s, wherein I introduce it as new music to some, while at the same time reminding others how good it was and still is. Till next time, be well, and thanks for tuning in.